Okay, well, hello, hey, great to see you all again, everybody. We're almost done with this session. Just a couple more weeks to go, so hang in there. Before you know it, it's going to be time to get going for the fall semester. Hopefully, you got your fall classes all ready to go, or have an idea of what you're going to be taking. And after that, it's almost time for the holiday season to get going again. So before you know it, it'll be trick or treat. A turkey and pumpkin pie, and of course, ho ho ho, Happy New Year, and all of that fun stuff. But we still have a little bit of time before we get to all of that. So let me go ahead and do a review of the readings from chapters 7 and 8 in the Who Built America text, and I'll say a few things about the PowerPoint program on the era of good feelings. I know the video I did for you last week did run a little bit long, almost as long as the video I did in the first video. So I'll do my best to keep this video within the 20-minute time frame. Definitely no more than 25 minutes. But if I can keep it in the range of, say, 20, 22 minutes, I think that'll be a good length for this particular topic. All right. Well, in this video, we're getting into a really fascinating era in American history, and this is the era that the historians often consider to be what's called the antebellum era. The antebellum era essentially is the period before the U.S. Civil War, and the term itself derives. It has more of a I think it's more of a Latin type of root, and it's a really fascinating period on so many levels. Essentially, the country by the turn of the century in the early 19th century, actually more so about the 1810s and in the 1820s, is really starting to get away from its, shall we say, agrarian roots. Thomas Jefferson really believed that the United States would be what he called a nation of small farmers, a godly people, which is a bit ironic because Jefferson, many historians argue, wasn't really a religious person per se. He's considered to be what's called a deist, in that Jefferson believed that there is a God, or in his words, a creator, and but unlike modern religions today, in which there's the idea of an ever-present God who intervenes, who's omnipotent and present in the everyday lives of people, Jefferson's perspective was, yes, there was a creator God, but he basically created the universe, and that was it. He doesn't really interfere or get involved in human affairs. Everyone takes care of his or her own universe after that. Once the idea of the universe is created, that essentially is, in my view, what Jefferson's ideas were all about. But my main point is that Jefferson believed that the United States would be a nation of small farmers. He wasn't really a big fan of the idea of that is of a commercial interest, industry, things that his counterpart Alexander Hamilton more or less believed in. So when Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809, he essentially tried to follow that pattern and in essence have the United States be a neutral nation that is not trying to get involved in a lot of world affairs, as Washington warned when he left office in 1797. But the impetus for the country really starting to change its focus was the aftermath of the War of 1812. The War of 1812, even though politically and strategically it created, of course, the idea of a national hero in the person of Andrew Jackson, for all intents and purposes, the war on a more pragmatic level was more of a disaster for the United States when it came to things such as infrastructure and, in essence, linking the country. And after Jefferson left office, what happened was, as his successor James Madison took office. Actually, Madison came into office just as the opening stages of the War of 1812 was starting to get going. So even though technically the War of 1812 took place during Madison's time, you might say the conditions which led to the War of 1812 happened a lot under Jefferson's watch, and Madison, in essence, had to deal with a mess that his predecessor left behind. So once the War of 1812 happened, that's when we get into the idea of, shall we say, the notion of national reconstruction, rebuilding the nation, an integrated nation. And that's the focus of what I want to quickly start off with in talking about the PowerPoint program on the era of good feeling. So let me quickly point out a few highlights of that PowerPoint program, and then I'll go ahead and say a few things about about some of the topics in both chapters 7 and 8. Okay, let me just get my get my notes here. Okay, I'll scroll down a little bit to the idea of the American system. And the American system, even though it's more associated with the presidency of James Monroe, who was elected in 1816, took office in early 1817, the idea for the notion of American system really happened more so under Madison's tenure as the War of 1812 finally came to an end. Madison was the second what was called the Virginia dynasty, in that you had three presidents from Virginia: Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And Madison's tenure was from 1809 to 1817. And the notion, and basically the premise was quite simple. In order for the United States to, shall we say, compete with European powers with respect to things such as a trade, especially trade. That is, the key for the growth of the country was through economic development. And have economic development, you've got to link the country. So you got to have a series of infrastructure items. Of course, infrastructure is something that's being talked about in modern terms. President Obama is definitely a big believer in this type of idea, but of course he's been battling Congress for the majority of his presidency. And undoubtedly, whatever happens, whoever the next president is, I think that'll still be a bit of a bottleneck issue. But the key to infrastructure, this American system idea, was improvements in roads, canals, the early forms of the railroads. And the idea of protecting American manufacturers. So even though by this point in time, Alexander Hamilton, who of course is really popular now with a play based on him, the play over in Broadway, Hamilton's ideas pretty much permeated the thinking of the presidencies of James Madison in his second tenure as president, his second term, and more so into James Monroe's tenure after he took office in 1870, following the election of 1816. So as the PowerPoint program illustrates, with all sorts of these advances in terms of technologies, infrastructure, Monroe also made it a point to ensure that the nation's diplomatic affairs were straightened out, and he had the capable diplomacy of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams as a Secretary of State, who helped to arrange treaties with Spain, Britain, and Russia, developing guidelines for westward expansion, foreign relations, the Monroe Doctrine, the idea of trying to prevent the Europeans from, shall we say, interfering in the affairs of the Americas, because at this point in time, a lot of Latin American countries were becoming independent, with people like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín in South America, and of course just south of the border in Mexico. Of course, he had the legacy of people like Miguel Hidalgo and José María Morelos, icons in Mexican history. So everybody from Mexico all the way down to Chile and Argentina, there was the movement of independence, and Monroe and Adams were quite fearful of, shall we say, Europeans, the British, wanting to get involved, interfere in the affairs of these Latin American republics. That's where the idea of the Monroe Doctrine comes into play as well. Is what I'm trying to say here. Okay, so on the surface, even though Monroe's tenure, Monroe's presidency, really started to underscore, or at least at least on the surface, this demonstrated that the nation was starting to rebuild. It was starting to get its affairs back in order. On many levels, there was a sense of unity, and this is where the idea of the era of good feelings came into play, because this era ostensibly foretold a focus in which there was no political fighting between shall we say federalist or anti-federalist factions. Some of the political battles which actually took place during the constitutional conventions, which I touched upon in last week's video. But beneath the surface, of course, there were some problems, and chief among the problems was the idea of slavery. As I mentioned in the one of the earlier videos, slavery was an issue which, of course, was tearing apart the nation, but it was an issue which poisoned other issues as well. And this stuff just festered and continued on for the remainder of the first half of the 19th century. Issues of representation began to come into focus. This idea of sectional balance. Okay, how many slave states should be admitted here? So if we admit one state as a free state, you have to admit someone as a slave state to, in essence, counterbalance. So in other words, the nation, after about 1819, when financial problems really took root, was called the Panic of 1819. This began to complicate matters, to compound things. In addition to the whole slavery issue, so essentially by the latter part of the 1810s through to the 1850s, you might say you had a really crazy patchwork of all kinds of compromises, resolutions, laws, ideas, principles, whatever you want to call it, to in essence keep the nation together. Right before the Civil War broke out in early 1861. These laws, these compromises, many of whom engineered by the famous Henry Clay, who's mentioned in the PowerPoint program, these essentially kind of step up. Let's put it this way: they stopped the bleeding, but they didn't get to the roots. In other words, let's say if the nation was a patient that required surgery, this would be like putting band-aids on a wound that needed extensive cleaning, or even a surgery. So that was the whole issue with some of these things, like the Missouri Compromise of 1821, and then other laws, other items which came down the pike into the 1820s, 1830s, and into the 1840s, and then culminated with the Grand Compromise of 1850, which I'll say a little bit more about in next week's video. Okay, so the PowerPoint program ends with the Missouri Compromise of 1821. So from that point in time, let me go ahead and jump off a little bit into some of the topics in chapters 7 and 8, and basically pick up the story from there. Chapter 7. As I said, gets into a lot more of these issues where the PowerPoint program leaves off. And by the time we get into the 1820s, as some of these political problems start to fester on many levels, this, you might say, creates a mood of distrust, of discontent, of anger, and not surprisingly either, this type of mood that seems to be prevalent in the United States today, you could find echoes of it in the United States in the 1820s and into the 1830s. So when you have this type of uncertain political climate in which people's way of life is being threatened, that is, whether you lived in the North or whether you lived in the South, not surprisingly, you're going to turn to people who maybe speak up for you and look out for you, look out for your best interests. And nowhere did that issue come to the forefront was the incredible election of 1824, which is discussed here in chapter 7. To quickly set things up for you, in 1824, John Quincy Adams, who was quite successful as the Secretary of State to James Monroe, ran for president ran for president against some other individuals too, like Henry Clay, who I just mentioned right now. But the man who tossed his hat into the ring was the famous Andrew Jackson. Jackson, of course, became a political and military hero with the War of 1812 when he and a ragtag bunch of men, escaped slaves, pirates, sharpshooters. Basically, it was a band of misfits fighting against British forces in New Orleans, put up a brave stand in defending the city in the Battle of New Orleans in early 1815. And even though theoretically the war between the U.S. and the British had ended at the end of 1814, the news, of course, didn't travel that fast to get to Mr. Jackson. And and the timing of the war, timing of the battle couldn't be better for Jackson. So, in essence, the victory against the British propelled Jackson to meteoric heights. He was a national hero. Keep in mind, the nation hadn't been that old, but you might say the nation was thirsting for new military heroes. Of course, the generation of previous people had long passed away. Washington was gone. People like John Adams and Andrew Jackson, they were elderly. They were out of the limelight at this point in time. So the nation, by the mid 1810s, wanted a new hero. They needed somebody new to, in essence, regenerate this spirit, the revolutionary spirit. So Andrew Jackson was at the right place at the right time. So for about the next 10 years, people talked about him. His name was being discussed, and when the election of 1824 took place, there were many people at the time who felt that he should run for the presidency too. We need a good, tough. We need a macho man to bring the nation together, and that he's going to tend to the needs of the people. Blah blah blah. That was the gist of Jackson's election, and as a result, was when the election took place, it was a historic affair in that nobody got a majority of electoral votes. You have to have a majority of electoral votes to win the election. Nobody got that. So because nobody got that, the House of Representatives had to decide the election, and that's the law. That's what it says in the Constitution. Well, after some haggling and finagling back and forth, the end result was that John Quincy Adams was selected as president, and Henry Clay became his Secretary of State. Well, all of Jackson's people went wild. They went crazy. They thought, shame, this is a rigged system. It's this, it's that, blah, blah, blah. The elites are taking over. They don't care about the needs of the people. So this became known as what's called the corrupt bargain, which technically it isn't the case, but politically that's the way it looked to many of Andrew Jackson's supporters. So all through the presidency of John Quincy Adams, he only served one term from 1825 to 1829. This just created the fertile ground for Jackson to really emerge as a powerful figure, a larger than life figure. Much like Mr. Trump has at this point in time. So by the time we get to the election of 1828, Jackson and his men were ready to go into action. They organized all kinds of events. There were all kinds of letters and newspapers, panels being published about how Jackson is a great man. He's this, he's that. John Quincy Adams, he's a goon, he's a thug, he's a baboon, he's this, he's that, blah, blah, blah. He's bringing prostitutes from Europe from the King of Prussia. I mean, really all kinds of wild and crazy accusations. If any of you saw the CNN show earlier in the year, the one with that Kevin Spacey hosted, it gets into a lot of great stuff about how nasty and ugly the election of 1828 was. But the point of all this here is that what Jackson did was he was the first real figure to really tap into the sense of national discontent, national distrust. And no big surprise too, because by the end of the 1820s, the nation is already moving away from a shall we say, agricultural, rural-based system, and more toward a wage system process. So if you read more of the stuff in both chapter 7 and 8, you can see a lot of the underpinnings in which the idea of working for wages, working for salary, becomes more and more of a dominant theme. And in that theme as well, of course, some of the early businessmen, they want cheap labor in order to make profits, to help move their products. So not surprisingly, immigration from other countries starts to become more and more of an issue in the 1830s and even more so into the 1840s. So again, here's an issue that's being talked about in modern times today, but that was an issue back in those days. And if you notice in some of the cartoons in both chapters 7 and 8, all kinds of negative portrayals of some of the early European groups coming to the United States. We're talking, of course, people like the Germans and the Irish. So this was stuff that was making a lot of people upset, a lot of people crazy. They felt early on back in those days that their nation was being taken away. They got to take back their nation. So not surprisingly, Jackson tapped into that sentiment, and because Jackson was able to use the idea of the corrupt bargain to help promote his idea that he's a man of the people, he has mass appeal to everybody. It doesn't matter if you were a poor farmer in the South, or if you're a working man in the North. Andrew Jackson is the man for you. He can unite everybody behind a common cause. And another thing too is that Andrew Jackson was the first man to really make use of a political guru, someone who knows how to bring people together and, shall we say, get everybody in line, unite the various factions, basically tell, okay, if Mr. Jackson gets into the presidency, he'll take care of you guys, he'll take care of you guys, and then he'll take care of you guys. When it comes to modern politics and people like the late Lee Atwater, who was George H.W. Bush, that's Papa George, that is Bush Sr., Lee Atwater was instrumental in his election. For George W. Bush, it was Karl Rove. And of course, for President Obama, it was people like David Axelrod, Martin Van Buren of New York. He was the man with a plan, so to speak, to help get Jackson to the White House. And then, shall we say, the rest is history. Jackson ushered in the era of what's called the notion of Jacksonian Democracy, that is, this notion of popular democracy, which is discussed in a lot of detail in both chapters 7 and 8. Jackson was president for 2 terms, but of course there were those who didn't like him. They thought his policies were outrageous. Personality too. The opposition to Jackson began the early became organized as the Whig Party, the anti-Jackson Party. So in essence, the Whig Party were the ones who felt that you might say there was too much democracy going on. They got to rein democracy in, that type of thing. And essentially, the Whigs were the antecedents, that is, the predecessors to what became known as the Republican Party. That is, today's modern Republican Party gets its roots from the Whig Party. And I'll talk more about the Republicans themselves in terms of their formation in one of the upcoming videos. Okay, let me see what else I should mention here. Okay, yeah, I think that pretty much does it here, everybody. I can see that I'm already going a little bit past 20 minutes right now, so I'll stop it here. But I thought it was important just to at least give you a broader picture of the idea of the era of good feelings and of Jackson's presidency. So if you still need to read the chapter, or you want to review some topics, take what I mentioned in this video here. I think it should give you a pretty good starting point to better look at, better examine the context, the details of what's happening as the nation moves further and further into the 19th century, culminating into the 1830s and 1840s. And I'll of course pick up on a lot more of some of these topics in the next video coming up next week. Okay, everybody. So that's it from here. You guys take care. And of course, I'll have another video for you next week in which we take a look at chapters 9 and 10 as the nation further and further gets closer towards civil war.